Chapter 66, Facing Death. Tenya walked right by Manuel as the pro-hero explained the basics of daily hero work as they patrolled. To Tenya's great shame, he had not been really listening for a while. He wanted to respect the pro and learn as much as possible, but he could not concentrate on the teaching, not now, not here. Even back at school, his thoughts would constantly descend to worrying over his brother, or even darker places. As far as he knew, Stain could have been just around the corner or in the alley they just passed, even on the nearest roof that Tenya diligently checked as his head turned around, looking for any sign of villains. Perhaps he was getting paranoid, but he had already thought he had seen someone on the roof several times, and since starting the internship sometimes had the feeling that someone was watching him. That wasn't something he usually experienced. Perhaps once or twice after Stain attacked Tensei, as Izuku refused to leave Tenya alone, and his eyes followed Tenya everywhere whenever he wasn't at home. The way he had taken to worrying about those he accepted around himself was most likely not healthy, but it was much better than the isolated bitter boy Tenya had met a year ago. Nowadays, he even smiled regularly. "We'll patrol Kyoto today too." "Sorry this is so monotonous," Manuel said, having finished his latest explanation. Tenya felt he needed to respond in some way, but it was difficult to speak calmly right now. There was some small relief in the fact he had chosen a costume with a face-covering helmet. He still tilted his head to not look at Manuel while speaking. "No, it is better this way." They kept walking in silence for a few more seconds, and Tenya was only waiting for the next explanation to begin. "Hey, this is kinda hard to ask, but you're after the hero killer, aren't you?" Tenya stopped, finally facing the man. "How did you?" he blurted out before stopping himself. Manuel held the back of his head, looking embarrassed. "I couldn't think of any other reason why you'd come to my agency." Manuel suddenly jolted like in realization and started speaking more defensively. "I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm really glad you did." He paused after the surprising concern, and when he raised his head again, the look in his eyes was as serious as Tenya had ever seen on the man. "You shouldn't be pursuing personal grudges. We heroes don't have the authority to arrest people or punish them. The only reason we are allowed to use our quirks is because of the regulations put on them. That's why, no matter how noble the reason might be, a hero must not use their quirk for themselves." For some reason, Tenya could hear Izuku's voice in the back of his head sarcastically commenting along the lines of how sure, that was the official line, but how many really followed it or were really made to? If a pro used their power for their selfish desires, it would be a very serious crime. Would it, in practice? Why would Manuel be giving this lecture for Tenya, wanting to catch a serial killer? Why would it matter why he wanted to do so? Suddenly, Manuel switched back to an incredibly unconfident and defensive tone, waving his hands in front of him. "I'm not saying the hero killer isn't super guilty or anything. You just seem like the really earnest type, you know? I'd hate for you to focus on a single goal and ignore everything else." Izuku's voice in Tenya's head added that he couldn't defeat Stain alone, so it should not even be his goal. Tenya pushed the voice aside. "Thank you. I appreciate it." "Oh, it's fine as long as you get what I am saying." He turned to continue walking. "So we good?" "No," Tenya thought. "What am I supposed to do, with this burning hatred, if I can't act?" He had never felt like this. Usually he had always wanted to do things right and follow the rules people with more experience had come up with. Maybe he had sometimes been a bit naive in that. It was hard to keep trusting in the rules with everything wrong that had been piled in front of him in the past months. Yet, he wasn't acting because he thought something was right despite being against the rules. He simply couldn't not act. He could not simply shrug and keep going normally, leaving Tensei behind. There had to be justice. He could not live without it. He was now regretting all the criticism he had given to Izuku in the past about his attitudes. Could barely look him to the eyes now. Tensei wasn't even dead like Izuku's mother, and here Tenya was unable to even think straight. He fingered his phone again, thinking he should say something. A message might be easier. Izuku and Hitoshi had basically admitted to being as close as they could be, but they would stop him if they could. They were surprisingly honest about it. Even Izuku, the one person who should understand Tenya's feelings, would try to stop him. He cared about Tenya, not Tensei. Tenya let go of the phone. He'd make this up to them later, somehow. He would have to. This was something he could not give up, not even for them. He could only hope they would forgive him as he followed Manuel, still not focusing on the man's words. He scratched the new exhaust pipes on his arms as they walked. They started itching every time he thought about why he had them. The patrol continued in peace as the sun descended. This seemed to be another quiet evening. It was good, of course, but did not give Tenya what he wanted, or even proper training. The sun was already almost down when an explosion rang out across the city, and soon thick smoke rose over the buildings ahead. Manuel was immediately on a call about the situation. "What did you say? Villains appeared?" "Don't worry, I can head there right now." Manuel half turned to face Tenya. "Stay with me." He started running as he spoke. "We're running." Tenya followed. He easily kept up with Manuel even without his engines. He had time to think. Fights between heroes and villains, and sometimes flashy villain attacks had become such a part of life people rarely considered why they happened, but all people's actions had reasons. Villains didn't attack just for no reason, usually. In the past, he might have just passed the question, thinking they were just villains being evil, but Izuku had challenged him for thinking like that. So why? The glow of fire and giant pillar of smoke ahead were not something you'd cause to commit simple theft, and Manuel had said there were multiple villains, so it wasn't someone just going off the rails for whatever reason. Only an extremely powerful person could cause something like this anyway. There was only one powerful person that was considered a real threat that he knew to be present in Hosu, Stain. Even Tenya's thoughts were dripping venom as he thought of the name. Couldn't be. This was different. That murderer wouldn't be so flashy, right? At least not with his actual attack. But if all the heroes responded to the explosion, Tenya stopped right next to a dark alley. Manuel kept running ahead, not even noticing. Tenya stared at the alley. Some heroes should be patrolling further that way. If Stain was going to strike now, it would be away from the battle and out of sight. Tenya's eyes widened, and he broke the rules and his orders by running into the alley, leaving Manuel completely. As he ran, he pulled out his phone. If others were close, they should at least know what was going on. Maybe they would have information too. Explosions and fire in Hosu, some kind of villain attack, multiple villains. Tenya thought for a moment after sending the message. "Where are your heroes?" He sent another before putting the phone away and looking around. The street at the nearest end of the alley seemed familiar. They had come past here earlier in the evening, but it was a pretty quiet area. They had only met one hero patrolling there, the hero native. If he was heading for the explosion, he should come through somewhere around here. If Stain was on the move, he'd need to find a hero alone. The phone beeped. Izuku was asking his location. Tenya hesitated, knowing exactly what he was going to use that information for, but now wasn't the time to be a difficult friend. If Tenya was going to find the killer, Izuku probably would not get there soon enough to stop him, and if he didn't, they would be safer together. At least it would spare Izuku some worrying. Tenya responded and kept running away from the fire. He turned a corner and found Native. The hero was pinned against the wall, held up by a hand pressing his head against the wall. Native was already bleeding from a wound, but there had to be something more wrong with him since he wasn't doing anything to fight back. He was held by a creepy-looking muscular man with a mask around his eyes and bandages tied around his arms, one of which was holding a sword that he was just raising. He was about to. He was Stain. Had to be. Tenya revved his engines and charged. The killer was distracted, thinking he had already won. Even if Tenya was still a student, if he only got one good attack in, it might be enough. Izuku had not let him forget how much damage his kicks could do, especially anytime Tenya trained against Hitoshi, or really anyone that wasn't Kirishima or Izuku himself. When the killer noticed and turned to see Tenya, Tenya's feet had already left the ground, and he was twisting for a kick that would break the killer's skull in a single strike. The sword swung up impossibly fast. It was coming for Tenya's head. It was going to hit. In the past, Tenya might not have even registered the strike before it was too late, let alone had any chance of avoid it. Changing directions quickly had always been his weakness, whether he realized it or not. Now he twisted more and forced one of Tensei's engines to start. His upper body jolted backwards. Stain's sword narrowly missed his head, but even though his upper body got pulled back, overall he kept moving forward as his legs swung further ahead, although with less force. His feet hit Stain's torso, kicking the killer backwards. They both fell on their backs opposite to each other. Native collapsed on the ground next to Tenya like he was completely paralyzed. There were no breaks during fights. Tenya remembered one of the Izuku quotes Hitoshi had written down from their training sessions. He bounced as soon as he touched the ground. Tensei's engines pushed him up faster than all of the crunches in the world, which he had done in the past few months. Still, Stain was faster, and getting up from the ground was essentially only the start of a new attack. His sword swung at Tenya again before Tenya could balance properly back on his feet. Despite moving back, Tenya could not avoid the attack completely. A close-up view of the blade got seared into his memory as steel slashed his helmet right across his vision. There was enough force to partially pull up the helmet and block Tenya's vision. He gave up his balance as his foot swung up, boosted by his engine. It at least brushed the villain, but Tenya fell again. He reached back with his hands, used both of his engines, and tried to do a flip. Kirishima wasn't the only one that had gotten chewed out for lack of agility and worked on it. Unfortunately, Tenya had not listened well enough before getting his costume done. It was not designed with maximum flexibility in mind. He couldn't quite reach far enough, and the ornamental exhaust pipes in his costume scratched the ground. Stabbing pain hit his lower torso on the right side as his flip collapsed. He tried to correct his position, to at least turn so he would face his opponent. Somehow Stain didn't instantly stab him again, so he was on his knees and was getting up as he finally had the chance to pull his helmet all the way off so he could see. He might have regretted that decision for the rest of his life as he witnessed the deranged grin and stare of the serial killer holding the bloodied sword in front of his face. An inhuman tongue reached out of the mouth and licked the blood. That was when Tenya's body stopped working. He collapsed on the ground, hitting his chin on the asphalt. Now he could only stare at the killer's feet. He could barely move his eyes and mouth, but the rest of his body refused to do anything. "A child wearing a suit," the killer said in surprise. "They are sending kids after me now? You should have run away from here. This is no place for children. You are carrying blades all over your body, and you are wearing a blood-red scarf. You must be the hero killer, Stain." "I came on my own," Tenya struggled to speak. My name is Ingenium. I have come to stop you." "Ingenium? Are you related to that fake?" "Yes, you have the same quirk. I am the brother of an incredible hero that you attacked. He is the best older brother that anyone could hope for. You will pay for what you have done." He still couldn't move. Stain huffed. "Does not look like it, and you do not look like a hero. You have no right to be called that. Both of you are nothing but fakes." "Shut up. You damaged his spine and paralyzed him from the waist down. He's never going to be able to work as a pro hero again. My brother was incredible. A caring person who saved many lives. Someone people looked up to. You had no right to take that all away from him." Tenya remembered many good moments with his brother as he spoke without even thinking. "He was my hero. My older brother inspired my dream that one day I could be a pro too. I won't forgive you. I'll kill you." There was a whiz of air as the sword swung through it. Tenya tensed, or would have if his body had been able to, but the pain never came. "Shouldn't you be worried about saving that guy? Here is a man about to be killed, who you think is a hero, and all you can think of is some petty revenge for another who is not even here. You focused on attacking me with no concern for him or anyone else. So busy with your grudge you forgot about him. You plan on using your quirk only for yourself, completely blinded by a selfish desire for revenge. Why did this killer's words sting so much? Someone like him could never be right. Fame, wealth, even revenge. These are selfish desires that have tainted the word hero. You may be young, but you are no better than any of these other fakes. And yet you would claim to be a hero? You are nothing more than a fake like the others, even if some of the righteous ones might be soft enough to accept your kind." There was a strange sound in his voice, like he was huffing, annoyed at something, or trying to be. "You have no right to talk about righteousness, you murderer," Tenya gasped. Metal whizzed through the air. "Gah!" He screamed as a sword sunk into his shoulder. "I may be a killer, but at least I do not pretend otherwise. Some people must die for a better world. You came here hoping to kill me because you believe the same, but you pretend to be different. You are even more fake than the others. You deserve death even more than your brother. Your kind are what most needs to be purged." His voice rose with the last words. "Goodbye, child. May your death bring about a better world. This was it. Tenya had done his best, but he could not take revenge for his brother. He had been too weak, had been too stupid and rushed in alone when he wasn't ready. He should have listened. If he had talked more, Izuku and Hitoshi would probably have helped him find Stain eventually, in some way where he could be caught without them dying. Now he was going to leave everyone forever. Tenya squeezed his eyes, shut with tears leaking out to his chin. Say whatever you want about me. You are still just a criminal who hurt my brother. A different swish cut the silence, one sounding much more familiar. Pain never came, but Tenya's paralyzed body was shook to the core as the entire alley was shaken by an explosion bright enough to shine through his eyelids. As Tenya opened his eyes, they were still facing the ground, and he could only see the rubble of a broken wall on the ground and Stain's feet that had moved several meters away, avoiding whatever caused the explosion further down the alley. Quick steps approached from behind Tenya, soon joined by a voice that was the most relieving sound he had never heard, but also colder and more full of venom than he had ever heard from anyone, enough to send shivers through even Tenya despite who was talking. Stay away from him, Izuku said with a promise of death in his words that Tenya, even in the deepest need for vengeance, could not have managed. His feet appeared in Tenya's field of view and stopped between him and the killer, illuminated by the bright bluish, nearly white, glow of Izuku's dragon blades. Despite the distance, Tenya could feel the near-burning heat on his face. It had to be unbearable for Izuku, but he did not even flinch. As he spoke again, the voice was calmer and lacked some of the venom, but the coldness was there, like it had completely overtaken the caring person who was ready to overhaul his house just to be more welcoming for friends visiting. Don't worry, Tenya. I am going to save you. Just a while earlier, Izuku had been sitting in a comfortable train looking out the window while Gran Torino explained instructions on what they were going to do, or tried at least. Izuku leaned his head against the window, deep in thoughts that did not involve the old man. He had exchanged a few more words with the elder about Shoto's situation since they got out of the taxi, but now the train was arriving in Hosu region and Izuku started wondering about Tenya again. He hadn't gotten any messages during the trip, but interns were supposed to stick with their pro, and Stain's victims had generally been alone when they were attacked. Are you even listening? Gran Torino grumbled.
No, Izuku responded.
He still didn't trust the man, but Gran Torino had been decent enough that Izuku didn't feel like lying needlessly, and he was already pretending in too many ways to add pretending he was paying attention to the pile. He blinked and leaned more against the window to better see ahead in the direction the train was going. The glow of the city seemed strange. Was that fire? His phone beeped, and he pulled it out as fast as Snipe would his gun. The message was from Tenya. Explosions and fire in Hosu, some kind of villain attack, multiple villains. Hey! Izuku turned suddenly, very interested in talking to the elder hero. He saved time by simply showing the message as another came through. Where are your heroes? Gran Torino frowned reading the messages. In the background, other passengers started noticing something was going on outside. It's like a building exploded, someone commented. He was followed by an announcement from the train. Passengers, please hold onto your seats. The announcement was barely over when the train started braking violently. Then the wall of the cart collapsed inward as someone was violently pushed through it. The train was full of screams before the dust cleared around the hero with an all-white costume and hair and animal-like claws. A large light blue arm struck through the hole in the train, slamming the hero's head to the floor as another expanded the hole for the creature to step inside. Nomu! Izuku gasped, soon turning to an angry frown. What the hell was Tamura doing? Izuku squeezed his fist, the one not holding his phone. He could not order the Nomu to leave in front of everyone, and letting it rampage wasn't much better. Whatever Tamura was doing, he'd have to manage it with one less Nomu. I want you to stay back. You hear me? Gran Torino moved and bounced across the carriage with his quirk, ending his path with his foot on the Nomu's head with enough force for it to let go of the other hero. He quickly bounced from the opposite wall and crashed against the Nomu with his entire body, pushing it out and away from the train. Izuku had to admit it was well done from the man, especially considering his age. He glanced around. People in the train were safe, and the hero on the floor was the only one injured. Izuku stepped to the hole in the wall, looking outside, seeing the glow of fires ahead better than before. He still did not understand what Tamura was seeking to do. Well, that wasn't completely true. Tamura had been bitter for a long time. For the USJ failure, for father giving Izuku attention, for Stain being talked about more than him. This all might just be a tantrum to put himself and his league in focus, and that meant he was going for nothing but indiscriminate destruction. That was the most dangerous thing he could be doing, and the most dangerous person to be doing it. Everyone in the whole region was in danger. Izuku glanced at his phone again, typing quickly, ignoring typos in a hurry. He was afraid of not getting a response, especially if Tenya was doing something stupid or Izuku-esque. A bit of weight dropped from his shoulders as a response with location and direction came back. Shirakuro had accumulated enough familiarity with the area that it did not take long for Izuku to realize Tenya was running away from the main area of the battle. Manuel might have told him to stay away, but Tenya would not run away from people in need even then. He couldn't face Tensei if he did. New dread squeezed Izuku's heart. The jets in his back flared, launching him off the train, leaving behind only a dust cloud. His first landing was rough due to the height of the railway and poorly timed adjustment of his jets, but after a few seconds for his ankle to recover, he began zooming across Hosu from roof to roof like Shirakuro never could or needed to. He even sent a message about coming and asking Tenya to update his location, but this time there was no response. Soon Izuku landed on a rooftop around where Tenya had reported his initial location, and after not finding him by looking from above, he slid down a drain pipe into an alley. Okay, Tenya was here and said he moved that way, he muttered. If he still wants to find Stain would stay away from such a flashy fight. Izuku stopped, but the heroes wouldn't, and in the rush they might be vulnerable. Who would patrol this way? Izuku realized he wasn't too far from where Shirakuro had first seen native harassing people. He was running again, this time using the jets to boost his running speed thanks to practice with Tenya. What if it wasn't enough? Even while running, he kept an eye on his messages and eventually took the risk of messaging his suspicions, minus parts that Izuku Midoriya wouldn't know. Despite the narrow space, he stuck to different alleys where Stain would make his move. He just passed one crossing of two when he noticed 3 forms in the other alley. 3 human forms, 2 laying on the ground and a sword raised over one of them. He twisted, sliding against the ground as the jets slowed him down. Dragon blades lit the narrow alley with heat that twisted Izuku's gloves and hurt the hands below despite the fireproof material. A fraction of a second later, an intense hellfire arrow launched towards the killer with a whistle and enough force that even Ijiro would crack from a hit. But Stain was too fast and jumped away. Instead of the red mist Izuku hoped to create, the hellfire arrow blew a hole in the wall which collapsed around the impact point. Izuku could feel the shockwave even where he was walking towards it, but that did not matter. Tenya was down, paralyzed by Stain's quirk, and he was bleeding. Izuku hissed out of pure protective bloodthirst. Stay away from him. Stain shifted his weight and held his sword a little more defensively as Izuku assumed a position between him and Tenya. Don't worry, Tenya. I am going to save you. Even if it meant they would be the only 2 to leave that alley alive. Chapter 67. Staying down. Izuku charged, boosting his speed with his jets. His arm was reached out and launched another hellfire arrow at Stain before even reaching within sword's reach. Shirakuro might have lost to this man repeatedly, but he had to hold back on Izuku's most destructive quirks. And he had needed the killer alive. There had been no need to defeat him no matter what. Izuku had neither restriction. His second shot was smaller than the previous one, but still blew another sizable hole in a wall after Stain dodged it. Didn't matter. He had already embraced calm mind, although his mind was nothing of the sort as the quirk had cleared any distractions from his murderous goal. There was only the soon-to-be dead man and the need to end it. With Izuku's speed, he was already upon Stain swinging the white-hot dragon blade.
No Izuku listen.
Tenya shouted from the ground. Stain had pulled out a large knife. If Izuku's face had not been stuck at the murder stare setting, he might have smirked before the dragon blade slid through the metal like hot katana through molten butter. Run, get help. I don't want you to get hurt too. Unfortunately, death still evaded Stain as he had evaded the strike behind the useless act of blocking it. He even let go and pulled his hand away to avoid most of the molten metal that sprayed from the stump of the knife. His other arm swung the katana at great speed. Even in the haze of bloodlust, Izuku knew even a single scratch would mean losing if stain got to his blood. One of the glowing blades had already shrunk and spread into a shield, moving in the way of the sword. Stain pulled it back at the last moment and tried to strike from a different angle, but Izuku dodged and rushed to fire another 2 hellfire arrows in rapid succession. Izuku? Somehow Stain avoided that, only losing a chunk of his long scarf, disintegrated into nothing as he ran and hopped backwards on the alley, followed by Izuku. The background hum of Tenya's worried pleads got more distant. Izuku fired a few more times. Anything that got them further away from Tenya was good. The motions of dodging took Stain's free hand out of Izuku's sight for an instant, but his shoulder twitched fraction of a second before the knife flew at Izuku. The smart thing would have been to evade or block with his quirk. Izuku dodged to the side, his hand shot out, the dragon blade disappearing just before his fingers closed around the handle of the knife near perfectly. It was much easier without extra arm guards, and while embracing calm mind so deeply, Izuku held onto the large knife as he reignited the dragon blade, each of them being in 90-degree angle to each other. Stain was already upon him. The katana strike ended up much like the previous one, but yet another now smaller knife had appeared in Stain's other hand. Izuku moved other dragon blade to block, but Stain was too quick, maneuvering the smaller blade around the quirk even though heat radiating from it burned his hand. Pain cut through Izuku's forearm and the knife he had stolen fell from his grasp. The dragon blade, freed from blocking the katana, slashed at the smaller blade faster than Izuku had ever struck, like a reflex when you touch a hot stove. The blade moved close enough to his own hand to melt the gloves even more than they already had, and cut through the knife while Stain was still pulling it back. All blood was either vaporized or left sizzling on the cut-off piece of now heated metal as it clanged against the ground. His forearm was still cut open, radiating pain throughout his arm, but it wasn't anything he didn't endure regularly, including from the killer in front of him. It would not be a hindrance for long. The bleeding was already slowing. He instantly moved back into a defensive stance, but even in his quirk-enhanced battle focus, he was able to be surprised by the fact he hadn't been struck again. No. Instead of continuing with a barrage of attacks, the killer was grinning. "I didn't expect to fight you tonight. I knew you acted more like wannabe hero than so-called villain." He paused. Shigaraki. Izuku's eyes widened, and only calm mind prevented him from exposing everything right there. The words were enough to get through the bloodlust behind his attacks, and he adjusted some of his focus from the fight to a verbal confrontation. "Who?" he asked, feigning confusion. Stain's grin only got wider. "You may have covered your face before, but I know when I am fighting the same person. You lack experience even in one style, and don't seem to be even trying to fake another. The quirks you use may be different, but the basis are the same." There wasn't even a hint of doubt in the killer's voice. "Also, your wound just healed." Izuku grimaced and bit his teeth together. "Now I wonder who are into your secret. I'm sure your fake hero of a friend, laying on the ground back there, is impressed with your rapid recovery." Izuku glanced at his bloodied, but no longer bleeding arm and grimaced. He couldn't let Tenya find out who he really was. Izuku had to jump back as Stain swung his katana at him. He didn't even take the small opportunity to strike back. Shirakuro could afford to risk being cut to take an opportunity Izuku could not. Even knowing the risk, he pushed regeneration to wait in the corner as he brought Dragon Blade up as a shield to deter another sword strike. "No wonder you were so soft on those fakes. You were trying to be one of them." "No." Izuku struck back with a swing that burned line onto a wall as Stain dodged. "But there are a few good ones. I will help them become heroes, and that includes making sure madmen like you won't kill them." Izuku turned after the killer to not be outmaneuvered, barely avoiding a thrown knife that passed Izuku's shoulder centimeters away. "Hero?" Stain asked more loudly and raised his katana, causing Izuku to shift in defense, but he only pointed past Izuku back down the alley where Tenya lied. At least Stain didn't keep shouting. Real heroes are supposed to work to save people. He came here for no other reason than to kill for revenge. Didn't even think about saving my target. I doubt you have shared the truth of this fake with that kid. He simply didn't care for anything but his personal desires. Izuku slashed at the sword trying to destroy the weapon, but Stain pulled it back too soon. "He is a human," Izuku responded, starting to seethe. "One whose brother you permanently crippled. No wonder you were so interested in Ingenium," Stain sneered. "I was hoping you had genuine conviction about him. I am getting tired of getting lectured about conviction from a murderer that kills for nothing but his personal desires." Izuku struck back both verbally and with a shot of Hellfire arrow. Stain's expression turned darker, and Izuku recognized the twitch of shoulder too late. The katana, which had dropped as Stain dodged the last attack, now swung up, stabbing Izuku's arm from below the dragon blade's protection. The stabbing pain struck the same forearm again, except this time the blade reached bone and something else essential. Izuku's hand now refused to do what he wanted. He slashed the weapon, cutting the blade in two with a spray of molten metal before Stain could fully pull it back, but it left his other side open. By the time Izuku could have moved to defend against the knife that had appeared from somewhere like his notebooks, it already sunk into his leg right under his hip. Stain's katana fell, and Stain's freed hand moved forward to grab Izuku's remaining working arm. Izuku tried to twist his hand to counter it somehow, and changing Dragon Blade's shape certainly caused burns. But Stain had caught him far enough above the hand to avoid Dragon Blade, vibration, or venomous nail, all of which were applied from the hands. There was a brief contest of strength between them, but even with all Izuku's training and density of muscle regeneration had helped him pack on a small frame, Stain still had the advantage in size, and Izuku had lost half of his leverage as his injured leg failed him. The alley spun around Izuku until his sight was filled by the ground and nothing else. He was still recovering from the impact as pain pierced his remaining good leg, and then the other leg again, and the shoulder of his injured arm. Izuku could only hiss and crush his teeth together, and that was with all his experience of pain. He tried to pull himself up, but even tensing a muscle to turn his leg came with paralyzing pain, and his limbs just refusing to work. Even if Stain had not used his quirk, he had Izuku trapped on the ground, just like Tenya. Izuku could see down the alley as he raised his head. It was starting to look like he couldn't avoid it. He'd have to heal right there. "Now," Stain said quietly, "let's see where your convictions lie and what they are worth. We both know I have not done anything you could not quickly come back from." Izuku gasped for air, realizing, "But they don't." "He doesn't." Stain's hate for Tenya came through even in his tone. "I don't know what you are seeking from playing a hero, but if you are exposed as Shigaraki, it will certainly be ruined. If you truly have conviction like you have pretended, you are prepared to do for what needs to be done and will not risk it. You will not allow yourself to be exposed." Stain paused, and a cold shiver went through Izuku. True conviction is something you never abandon, even if it requires sacrifice. Not that one fake should count as such. Show your conviction. Stay down, and your secret is safe. Stain stepped past Izuku, stabbing the back of his remaining good hand as he did. "I will spare you to see what you choose, at least until you have made your choice, but you have to choose quickly." Stain continued walking towards Tenya, a second sword in his hand as he approached Tenya. The image of the killer about to deliver the killing blow flashed in Izuku's eyes. No, in Shirakuro's eyes. The life of Izuku Midoriya was over. If this madman thought he couldn't work for his goals without the charade of Izuku, if he thought Izuku would sacrifice the one thing that made his own life worth living, the one thing, or five, that gave him hope that heroes could be better, Stain would be wrong. Izuku began releasing the regeneration from its shackles. Running steps approached from behind him. Could it be help? All heroes had already headed to the Nomu attack. "Izuku! Izuku, are you here?" was shouted behind Izuku, shouted by an intensely familiar voice that made Izuku hope, dread, and almost smile at the same time from hearing it. He held back on the regeneration. It might have been stupid, but there was still a chance, however slight, that everything might be okay. "Kirishima, don't run in alone," an unknown voice shouted. There was no response in words, only two pairs of running steps. "Check on him. He needs first aid," the strange voice said just behind Izuku before a pair of feet ran past Izuku and there was a thump as something hit the ground next to him. "I should have paid more attention on the first aid lesson," Ijiro muttered. A strong hand grabbed Izuku's shoulder and head and tried to turn him around, but even Izuku couldn't take that without a hiss and didn't even need to pretend by resisting a whimper. Sorry, are you okay?
No.
Tenya, Izuku gasped and nodded his head forward as soon as he caught his breath. The hero with Tenya had something black in the shape of a sword that clashed with what was left of Stain's katana. It's okay. Mr. Brave is a pro. Everything is going to be okay. Izuku almost believed it when Ijiro said it, but as subtle as it was, he could hear rare doubt sneaking into Ijiro's voice. It did not suit him. Everything is going to be okay. Repeating the words didn't help. Chapter 68. No more regrets. As much as Ijiro wanted to save people a while earlier, he couldn't even imagine how the night would end. Mostly he was just excited to be actually patrolling as a hero, walking next to Mr. Brave with a wider-than-usual grin on his face. Even strange looks people gave them every now and then couldn't change that, but even if Ijiro wasn't always naturally the most perceptive person, he noticed it after a couple of times, and overhearing people talking about the topic of the day. His smirk was briefly replaced by surprise, and there was screech, crash, and shouting. Mr. Brave had already ran several steps before Ijiro got moving, but he quickly caught up to the man. There had been a motorbike accident. An old man was just getting up from the ground at a pedestrian crossing after falling, but seemed to be okay. The big motorbike had hit the wall of a building and fallen over. The driver was under the bike. His helmet-covered head was moving as he tried to push the heavy bike with help from someone else, but they had difficulty with the large bike just dragging it more than lifting. Be careful, Brave told them. If there are injuries, dragging the bike against him can make things worse. We need to lift it up cleanly. Yes. Okay. Ijiro said as he hardened his entire body and reached over the bike to get a grip. He smiled at the biker. Let's get this off you. I'm sorry if there are any dents, but looks like you need to get out quick. Why, sure, don't worry about it. The man finished with a painful grunt as he made the mistake of moving. Ijiro felt metal bend under his rocky fingers as he made sure to get a good grip and pulled. People often thought he was just as strong as he looked, but you don't punch through concrete walls with just that, no matter how hard your skin is. Izuku had reminded him of that more than once whenever Ijiro doubted his abilities. The bike came up smoothly and Ijiro set it against the wall. He turned to give Mr. Brave thumbs up. The hero had a strange look on his face and his shoulders were down. Did I do something wrong? Ijiro asked. Surprised look on Brave's face was a relief. What? No. Great job. I'll see to his injuries until ambulance arrive. Check on the other man. He nodded to the old man who had now gotten away from the street. Ijiro rushed to the man, but the situation was over quickly as soon as an ambulance arrived for the biker. As the injured biker was lifted and Ijiro pulled out his phone to tell everyone he gotta help save someone. Hitoshi had apparently changed the chat name again. Ijiro chuckled seeing the name Izu's Nappy Time. Ijiro preferred the manlier Midobro. Izuku punched more than hard enough to have earned a manly nickname, but Ijiro could see how Hitoshi would have some fun with the cuter name. Midoriya changed Izu's Nappy Time into Just Wait for the Weekend. So Midobro was awake. Good morning, Ijiro quickly typed. I want to see the miracle maker that actually convinced him to sleep, Hitoshi added soon after. Ijiro had to agree it was impressive of the hero Izuku was interning with. I'm not that bad, Izuku responded. How many full nights have you slept after getting that quirk? Ijiro was left waiting for a response, but had to look up from the phone as couple people stopped next to him. They were other heroes. Hey Brave, who's the kid? One of them. A giant man twice Ijiro's height and probably 3 times his weight, all muscle, asked smiling. So manly. My name is Ijiro Kirishima, Ijiro declared louder than necessary and bowed politely. I am student at UA interning with Mr. Brave. Oh right, he mentioned about getting an intern. How does it feel to be working as a hero? It is amazing. We just got to help someone from an accident. I really just wish Brave gave me harder training. The group laughed. Sounds like you're going to do fine. Hey Brave. The man looked up at Brave behind Ijiro. Seems you go. What happened to you, dude? Your face looks like someone poured purple paint on it. Oh, this? Brave responded. Just a little accident. It's been a while since I trained any students. The kid did that? The large man asked and smirked while glancing at Ijiro. Well, I guess it is not that surprising. He looks like he can throw a mean punch. Thanks, Ijiro beamed at the hero. I train really hard with my friends every evening and weekend. These friends, might we have seen them at the sports festival? Sure did. If you want to see a good punch, you should see Izuku's Dragon Fist. He's the one who kicked my ass at the festival. So you lost to Hai. The large man stopped. He and his fellow heroes had strange expressions on their faces. Yeah, Ijiro broke the silence. He's really tough and even better at figuring out what I need to train. He even installed this big metal cube on his yard as a kind of punching back for me. The group didn't seem to get caught up in his excitement. Another man with white hair and white costume with hands that looked like tiger paws spoke first. Weren't you beaten by that quirk stealer kid, and didn't he take your quirk? Ijiro frowned, at least a bit, as much as he was capable of, and raised his arm which hardened with a snap in front of the group. I loaned it to him. He hasn't stolen anything. Hope so. Imagine what people would say if a hero started stealing people's quirks. I think we already got the answer today, the large man interrupted, crossing his arms. That's frankly a bit more serious than someone having the ability to take quirks. That's for sure. The media is turning into bloodhounds, the white-dressed man said. Getting stopped by reporters for a few words is almost daily business. But now some of them are questioning what we think about Long Arm and if people should still trust us since he worked with our agency. He shook his head. That guy couldn't just keep his mouth shut. Really had to mess things up for all of us. But then he wouldn't have been exposed as criminal, Ijiro said as the most obvious thing in the world. That's the point, the white-dressed man said, annoyed. Not like it changed anything, not anything good for us at least. People know the truth about it. They think they do. Just because he had his way with women doesn't mean he wasn't a hero, even if some of them decided they didn't like it afterwards. And now people think they know him, or us. They should just shut up and let us do our work if they want to be protected, be heroes. The white-dressed guy turned away, crossing his arms. It has been a tough day, a woman next to him said. She was dressed in all-black skin-tight costume, and also had animal-like hands covered in black fur like some big cat, though they weren't as large paws as the man. She leaned closer to Ijiro with a smirk, looking him over. But I think it is turning better. You are the first person I've liked to see today. Next time you are looking for an agency, perhaps you will consider ours. There's always room for a man who is hard enough to not scratch too easily. She held one of her hands between, making scratching motion as her long, sharp-looking claws came further out her hands, especially once you get old enough. Black cat, the white-dressed man with claws said, quieter than before. Don't flirt with high schoolers in front of people. Oh, you're no fun. She leaned back straight and waved her hand dismissively. Or perhaps you are worried he is already more of a man than you, dear brother? The man sighed and started walking away, muttering something incomprehensible. The woman, Black Cat, winked at Ijiro and stepped past him, brushing her hand against Ijiro's upper arm. The arm hardened under the touch. Nice. See you around. She followed the man. Ijiro soon turned his eyes down to watch his hardened arm. He hadn't intended to do that. It had happened instinctually before he even knew about it. Usually that only happened when someone, usually Izuku, was about to strike him fast enough that there wasn't time to think. Why'd he done the same just because a hero touched him? Sorry about that, the large man interrupted Ijiro's thoughts. She seems to be a bit flirty, even with some villains. I don't think she really meant anything. I hope, he muttered quietly and raised his hand in goodbye. Well, maybe we see again. Make sure to take full advantage of the internship. He said separate goodbyes to Mr. Brave and followed his companions. Well, seems like are already getting some attention, Brave said and put his hand suddenly on Ijiro's shoulder. Maybe it is good thing I managed to snatch you first. Come on, we have to continue the patrol. Sun will go down soon, and that is when the most action happens. Right. I'm excited for my first night as a hero, Ijiro said, still looking after the trio walking away. It is a big moment, but are you sure you are going to be okay? The air is going to get cooler after it gets dark. I'm fine, Ijiro declared, punching his chest. Some cooler isn't going to stop me. It just reminds me to exercise more to keep warm. I doubt you need that, but hey, you are the one going to be cold, so at worst it is a lesson. You kids often care more about style and showing off than being warm, until it comes back to bite them. Heh, if it does it should watch its teeth. Brave shook his head as he kept walking. As they weren't talking right then, Ijiro checked if Hitoshi had gotten an answer from Izuku yet. He hadn't, and the talk had moved to a different topic, the same that the group of heroes had just talked about. Thinking about it as he read made Ijiro sadder and a bit angry. He had dreamed his whole life about being a hero, but what if heroes weren't what he thought? It can't be true, can it? That's so not manly, especially for a hero, he wrote in response to the conversation. The chat remained quiet for a moment, but soon Izuku is writing text appeared. Ijiro tensed, afraid of the message. I'm not surprised. Really? Ijiro asked. I mean, I know you can be pessimistic about how things are, but why would you expect so? Ijiro felt bad about the question he was about to write and started deleting it, but his fingers slipped, and he sent part of the message by accident. He rushed to write another message. Sorry, He never finished that either. With so many protections and privileges for heroes, stuff like that is inevitable as long as they think they won't get caught or held responsible, Izuku responded. And no one is even seriously trying to filter them out. Remember how egomaniacal almost murderer got into UA? Yeah, he did. To think Ijiro had tried to make friends with that guy. For a moment Ijiro even thought he was really manly, but maybe he was just blinded by the guy's strength. He should have seen the warning signs. They literally blew up on his face and hurt even his ears. And then there were those heroes he just met. I guess you were right, Ijiro responded. I heard some heroes talking about it. They sounded more worried about how people reacted to what he has done than what he did. That's how they get away with it, Izuku responded. I would be careful if you meet heroes from his agency. Too late for that. I think I already did. They are the ones I met. Still, it is hard to believe. How could he? Heroes are supposed to save people, not what he did. They were supposed to save people. That was why he wanted to be one. He had never doubted that. Today he had heard several people doubt if they could trust heroes. For the first time, he had to ask it of himself. It felt unreal. Could it be fake? Could be, but some news titles said there was more than just the video. They talked about that for a couple of messages, and even Hitoshi joined along. Soon they were talking if Izuku should make a website of his notes. Izuku helped Ijiro see things better, but Hitoshi really made them feel more at ease. Even Ijiro could feel it as soon as Izuku wrote the very first response to Hitoshi's message. Reading the chat was a joy. Now they were talking about how Izuku writing about Hitoshi would just be another sales pitch. Ijiro quickly typed in, "Can you add me on there too? Didn't he already make a sales pitch of you to All Might?" Hitoshi asked. Ijiro tensed and might have gotten a little redder on his face, not just hair. He tried to not think about the conversation between Izuku and All Might. He wanted to be a great hero, but what he had heard was just overwhelming. No one had ever praised him quite like that, not even his parents. He wasn't anywhere near what Izuku seemed to think, though usually Izuku was good at things like this. Did just his smile really matter that much? He knew people considered him happy personality, but never thought smiling would really matter like that. Maybe it was just Izuku. The dude really needed anything positive he could get in his life. Ijiro was still shocked by that one night and morning after the sports festival. He had long considered Izuku one of the toughest, manliest guys he had ever met. Seeing him scream in his sleep and crying just from being asked if he was okay had been bigger shock than any of his punches. Somehow the strongest guy in their training group had managed to look genuinely tiny and fragile when talking to Ijiro, like someone who really needed rescuing. Even all of the mysterious instructions Hitoshi had given Ijiro while they trained hadn't truly prepared him for that. He could take a lot of hits without cracking, but seeing Izuku like that stabbed straight through his armor. He shook his head to clear his thoughts and stretched his lips. If Izuku thought smiling was good, it had to help others too. At least if he could save more people, he could show Izuku how much good his training had done. Anything to save Izuku from whatever dark place he lived in. Ijiro would regret it rest of his life if he wouldn't, and he had promised himself to never do that again. Ijiro had to respond something to the message though. Nothing too serious for just a chat message. Oh yeah, maybe not that much. Yes, that much at least, but I'm not starting a website. I want to choose who gets my notes. That was a relief actually, and the conversation moved to the revelation that Izuku had prepared separate notebooks for each of them. Ijiro had actually noticed the line of new notebooks that looked almost like a rainbow with their colors, but never touched or asked about them. If there was something Izuku was willing to share, he would do it when he felt okay to. Ijiro smiled since that time seemed to be now. He waved at another hero they passed, handing someone to police. A screaming woman with some black and yellow shapes on her skin from her quirk. She also had pretty thick-looking gloves, even though the weather was still pretty warm. She screamed she hadn't done anything. That native was crook and no better than Long Arm. Every criminal claimed they were innocent, of course. She was probably just using the news as an excuse. But now Ijiro couldn't be sure about that. He stopped to glance back at them as the woman was pushed into a police car. It was hard to make out any words in the screaming, but she shouted something about native, just using her for cash, and something about wishing Stain would get him, or Ijiro wasn't sure, but he thought she said something about Shadow-sama. Ijiro tried to think of something similar sounding she could have said. Kirishima, Brave called. Are you coming? Oh yeah. Ijiro responded and took some running steps to catch up. Keep your eyes open, Brave said. The sun is going down and after that is when the most trouble starts. Right? Ijiro nodded. Then sun reached the horizon as they kept walking, but it was quiet. There were no signs of trouble. Ijiro found himself disappointed at that, then at himself since trouble would mean someone was in danger. Quiet was good. There was a distant explosion that rang out across the city, and as Ijiro spun to look around, he soon spotted a pillar of smoke in the distance. This time Brave didn't need to say anything. Ijiro was moving at the same time with him. His phone soon vibrated. It couldn't be a coincidence. The message was from Tenya. Explosions and fire in Hosu, some kind of villain attack, multiple villains. Where are your heroes? Okay, at least they knew. Might be there first, since Ijiro had spent the past hour walking in the opposite direction. Izuku messaged soon. Ijiro should have realized to do that. That's why he took internship with Brave in the first place. He still had a lot to learn to be a hero. A moment later, Izuku sent new messages. They repeated the fear they had about Tenya looking for Stain, and something in how Izuku wrote about it made Ijiro convinced running into the killer wasn't only a risk anymore. And he recognized the locations in the messages. Brave, he shouted. This way. He pointed at an adjacent street. Kirishima. Wait, the fight it this way.
Sorry.
There are others in danger, and no pro knows. Surprisingly, Brave followed Ijiro. Kirishima. What do you mean there are other people in danger? What's the danger? Stain. Ijiro responded, I think. How? Ijiro held his phone up. That doesn't explain any. There was a boom. Ijiro slid to a halt as a window next to him shook visibly. This explosion was closer, a lot closer than what they heard before, but it had reverberated from the walls surrounding them on every side. Stay sharp, Brave said, holding a sword made of his own hair. Ijiro followed the instruction literally as he activated his quirk across his body. Did you catch which direction it came from? No, Ijiro said. He pulled up his phone. No new messages. He started typing WH when a second explosion echoed around them. Both focused on it intently. Maybe ahead here, Ijiro pointed at the direction he had been running before, trying to remember the map of the area. They continued moving, but now slower. 2 more explosions happened in rapid succession. Both Ijiro and Brave pointed at the same direction. That way. They ran towards the sound, but there was a long break without further explosions, so they could only hope it was the right direction. Finally, there was another explosion and saw a blue flash reflect from windows behind a corner down the street. Something about these explosions was feeling really familiar, especially that blue flash. Ijiro ran a little faster, pulling ahead of Brave. He dove into a nearby alley. There was a large hole in a corner of a wall where 2 alleys crossed and strange burnt smell hung in the air. Izuku. Izuku, are you here? Kirishima, don't run in alone. Brave shouted, but at that moment Ijiro saw 4 other people on the alley, 3 of them on the ground. Izuku's bright white hair was distinct even in the darkness. He was one of the people on the ground, and even from the distance Ijiro could see the blood. Ijiro gulped while running. Someone who could do that to Izuku was a real threat. Could they even stop the man standing further down the alley? No, he couldn't think like that. This was what he had trained so much for. If he was too weak to save his friends, what hope did he have to ever be a hero? He would not live with regrets of failing to save them. Refused to. Check on him. He needs first aid, Brave ordered as they approached Izuku. Ijiro hesitated a fraction of a second, but this close he could smell the iron stench of blood. Ijiro stopped and dropped on his knees fast enough that he hardened his legs before hitting the ground. Izuku was laying on his stomach face against the ground. I should have paid more attention on the first aid lesson, Ijiro muttered. He was pretty sure the first thing was to make sure the victim was and could breathe. He grabbed Izuku's shoulder and tried to support his head and pulled to turn him around. Izuku hissed and whimpered like Ijiro didn't realize him capable of. Sorry, are you okay?
No.
Tenya, Izuku gasped and nodded his head forward as soon as he caught his breath. Brave had reached the villain and took him on in a sword fight. It's okay. Mr. Brave is a pro. Everything is going to be okay. He wished he had believed that, but if this was Stain, he had already killed several pros, and Brave hadn't yet shown Ijiro his full power, he hoped. Everything is going to be okay, Ijiro repeated, trying to convince himself. He pulled out one of the tourniquets Izuku carried as part of his costume, though all of his wounds would probably take everyone both of them carried. Good thing you made all of us carry these, Ijiro said nervously as he started hastily tightening the first one on the most bleeding wound in Izuku's leg. No, don't worry about me, Izuku shouted and tried to push his arm away with the only one of his that still seemed to work, except for the continuing bleeding of his palm. Help him. Stain will kill Tenya after he loses. My injuries aren't as bad as they look. There's no point to help me if you don't stop him. Izuku gasped for air. Stain's quirk needs him to lick your blood from his sword. Don't let him cut you. I don't think he can hurt you if you don't. Izuku somehow managed to smile. You might be perfect man to stop him. Ijiro pressed his hand firmly on Izuku's shoulder and hardened it. Don't die, Ijiro said. The moment took less than a second before he pushed up and was already charging forward, heart racing. He wouldn't be too weak to help people, to help his friends. He was never going to feel that helplessness again. Chapter 69. Sword versus Rock. You might be the perfect man to stop him, Izuku said as the realization hit him. Perhaps it was just Shirakuro trying to convince him to not expose himself. He shouldn't risk Ijiro's life to keep his secrets. Ijiro pressed his hand firmly on Izuku's shoulder and hardened it. The expression on his face had gone from doubt and worry to determination he rarely showed, only when he declared he would never regret being too weak again. Don't die, Ijiro said. Was that an actual order? Ijiro had never given one. The moment took less than a second before he pushed up and was already charging forward. Izuku pushed through the pain to raise his head enough to see down the alley as Ijiro ran towards the serial killer. Izuku made sure to zoom his vision to keep up with what was happening. Somehow Mr. Brave had avoided being sliced up. Then again, he was specialized in sword combat, or at least sword-like hair combat, even if Ijiro hadn't been convinced by his strength. Ijiro reached them just as their swords clashed and went in with a swing that forced Stain to back away. Ijiro had gone around to approach from the side Tenya was laying on, so he had already helped make Tenya safer. At least now there was a boulder between him and the killer. But Stain was not so easily deterred. He struck out again. Brave barely parried it, giving Ijiro another opportunity to strike, but Stain was still too quick. They seemed to manage on defense. That was Ijiro's specialty after all, but that could not last forever. Ijiro seemed to think the same, launching a barrage of punches, driving Stain back against the wall. It was an impressive achievement for Ijiro. Actually, it was too impressive even for him. It seemed like Stain didn't get a counterattack in, but it was clear he did not even try. Ijiro's arm rose to make another strike, but Stain swung faster. A knife flew out right under Ijiro's arm at Brave, who didn't see it in time from behind Ijiro. It seemed like he evaded it, or at least didn't suffer any serious injury. Izuku knew better. Stain dodged Ijiro's punch, which sunk into the wall, surprisingly deep at that. If he actually hit Stain properly, it would easily have killed him. Was Ijiro really fighting that seriously, or did he just lose focus in a real fight? Stain jumped and pushed off the wall, basically flying past Brave, blocking his attempt at slashing the killer midair. Stain spun around and landed on his feet. By that time, he was holding the knife he threw earlier. Brave collapsed on the ground as Ijiro pulled his fist out of the wall and turned around, ready for the next round. Now he was alone. Izuku gritted his teeth. Why wasn't he already there turning Stain into ash? Stain had killed tons of pro heroes. Why was Izuku still relying on Ijiro fighting him? He had to help, even if it meant he would lose everyone. So why hadn't he already gotten up and gone there? Izuku gritted his teeth. Ijiro couldn't even get a hit in. Stain had lectured Shirakuro for lack of experience for long days, and now Izuku could truly see the same difference between the killer and Ijiro, who still had the tendency to extend himself too much while going for an attack like the punch he just made. Stain evaded it easily and shifted his hold of his katana. Izuku gasped. Stain swung the sword in a wide horizontal swing faster and with more power than Izuku had ever seen him do. It was a decapitation strike aimed straight at Ijiro's neck. It hit and kept moving until passing Ijiro's neck on the both sides. Izuku gasped, incapable of breathing. He wasn't even sure if his heart pumped for a second. His eyes widened, tears already trying to push out. The part of the sword behind Ijiro's neck flicked away and clung against the wall behind. The other half of the sword still held by Stain stopped and moved back into a more defensive stance as the man avoided another fist. Whatever force had squeezed Izuku's throat and heart released its grip as he remembered why he had risked relying on Ijiro instead of paying the price of joining in. That didn't mean he was convinced it was right. A villain would use someone they called friend like that. Then again, wasn't that what he was already? Stain used the remnants of the katana for another strike, swinging it with apparent rage. But the attack was only a distraction to lure Ijiro's arm up in defense as another gnarly-looking knife stabbed under the arm right into armpit and joints of the shoulder. Good thing Ijiro's armor was not a suit of armor with such weaknesses with joints, and he had gotten better at making sure there were not openings by accident. Izuku always went for those if Ijiro didn't keep his defense up all over, just like that first time when Ijiro had his hardening slip just long enough for a punch at the gut. It wasn't as easy to do anymore, which was why he was still alive. All the sweat Izuku had squeezed out of him was at least worth it. And Ijiro wasn't done. This time he was fast enough to catch the knife from its blade before Stain pulled it all the way out, and this time, despite Stain being bigger, he did not win the tug-of-war and had to give up the weapon. Ijiro tossed the bent knife. Stain seemed to be talking. Why? Ijiro said loud enough for Izuku to hear. You tried to kill them. Stain said something more, but he was at the wrong angle for Izuku to try to read lips. No, I did that before. I'll never do it again. I'll never be that weak again. Ijiro jumped forward with uncharacteristic intensity. He was almost always intense, especially with any kind of training, but this was more the kind of intensity driven by grief and anger. Izuku was very familiar with that kind of intensity, just not with Ijiro. Ijiro struck out with what seemed like another wallbuster. He was still fighting too straightforward and raised his arm to block similarly useless stabs from yet another knife, now aimed at his face, possibly his eyes. That still shouldn't work any better than the previous attacks. Izuku knew from experience. His heart had calmed down considerably from just a moment earlier. Ijiro suddenly pulled his blocking arm back and caught the knife as it was striking at him. That was new. Their fingers were entangled with Ijiro literally squeezing the weapon out of his enemy's hand. Stain used his other arm to slash at Ijiro's face repeatedly with the broken katana, but to no avail. Izuku could hardly believe it, but the hero killer started to look desperate. Give up, Ijiro shouted. I'll never let you go. Perhaps he had really won. Stain's stare turned darker. Perhaps you really have what it takes to be a real hero, unlike these others, Stain declared to Izuku's great surprise, but his tone. We will see about that. He held out yet another knife ready to throw, but he wasn't aiming for Ijiro. Ijiro realized that too, and tried to stop it with his free hand. But it wasn't enough. Stain tossed the knife at Native. Ijiro spun around, letting go of Stain in an attempt to reach the thrown knife. Stain had thrown it slow, and Ijiro managed to just narrowly swipe it with the tips of his fingers. Disappointingly, that was enough to make it miss the man laying against the wall. Stain bolted, running towards Izuku. Perhaps this was best. If he escaped, he could still expose Izuku, but he wouldn't be hurting anyone here, and at least on the loose he wouldn't be interrogated right away. Their eyes briefly met, and then Stain had passed. Ijiro was already running after him, but his ultimate defense didn't do much for his speed. Despite how fit and fast runner Ijiro was, speed was one advantage Stain held. There was a familiar clinging behind Izuku. The air got colder while he struggled to turn with his injuries. There was a giant ice wall blocking the entire alleyway with two comforting forms standing in front of it and the stopped killer. Another stream of ice burst along the ground towards Stain, but the killer was too quick even for that and jumped aside at the last moment. "Hey, Stain!" Hitoshi shouted. Stain's head spun around just as he jumped to evade Shoto's attack. Wah! It was over, or would have been if not for one thing. Stain fell on the ground hard, then jolted and relatively gracefully bounced back on his feet. The squeeze around Izuku's throat and heart came back with vengeance. "Great trick," Hitoshi shouted, but even he couldn't completely mask the nervousness in his voice, and Stain did not fall for it.
Bang!
Stain shuddered as the surprise quirk struck again, but he was already on it and slapped a hand on his mouth. His other hand already had yet another knife in it. He evaded another ice attack, then leaped towards Hitoshi. Izuku forced his injured hand to move as sparks of blue fire appeared agonizingly right over his wound. Before he could take the shot, he was blocked by a rock-hard mess of red. This time Ijiro hit. There was a sickening crack as his fist hit somewhere around Stain's shoulder. The killer spun all the way around from the power of the impact, and the knife flew off the newly useless arm. Miraculously, Stain avoided falling over, stopping himself with his remaining limbs. Instantly, one of his feet swung up. A sharp spike on his boot sunk right between Ijiro's legs. The force made Ijiro jolt a bit upwards, but he didn't show any sign of pain, not even a sound. Instead, he grabbed Stain's leg with both arms and yanked. With a quick spin, he threw the killer face first on the wall. With that turn, Ijiro's face came in sight. His stare wasn't just determined but angry like he had never shown before. It was the kind of stare telling people, "Stay away from him, you don't want to fight me." A very Izuku-esque stare. Izuku wasn't sure if he should be proud, sad, or terrified. Stain began collapsing after the impact. Unclear if he was even conscious, but a mass of ice struck him, pinning him against the wall. Complete silence filled the alley for a few seconds. Then there was one more thud as Ijiro fell on his knees, thankfully before releasing his quirk. His shoulders were crouched, head down, seemingly staring at his hands. There went the only person in the group who didn't need therapy before. Chapter 70. Shadows Left Behind. Izuku stopped fighting the pain and let himself lay down. He leaned on the calm mind to block pain and concerns out of his mind and focus on the sounds of the others as he let his eyes rest for a moment. A couple of running steps approaching, heavy breaths. Surprisingly, Shoto spoke first, not quite next to Izuku yet. A pause. You okay? Silence. Ijiro? Hitoshi asked this time. I'm okay, just... Sounds of him scrambling up and running steps approaching. Izuku is hurt. There was a thud of knees hitting the asphalt, and it did not sound like they were stone as they hit this time. What happened? Hitoshi asked. He was like this when I arrived. The tourniquet Ijiro had been placing before got pulled so tight the calm mind, and extensive experience from shattering bones were the only things preventing Izuku from shouting. I mean, he was conscious then. Ijiro's voice was getting more panicky. HSS, Izuku hissed, both hoping for some silence and trying to calm the redhead who usually calmed him. I'm still conscious. Oh, that's a relief. Go check on Tenya. Don't worry about me, Izuku commanded. Sounds like himself at least. Good to know he didn't get hit in the head too hard. Hitoshi tried to ease the situation, but the words were forced, and his worried tone didn't really do it. I'll go check on him. He got hit by Stain's quirk. It's why he can't move. Izuku, Hitoshi said with a harsher tone. You are laying in your own blood. Focus on yourself for once. Izuku shut up as Hitoshi left, just laying there as Ijiro and Shoto worked to stem his bleeding. It's going to be okay, Ijiro said again, but it wasn't clear for whose sake. It will be now, Izuku said quietly, but with much more confidence. Great job, sword-breaking hero Red Riot. More like bone-breaking, Ijiro muttered under his breath. Life-saving, Izuku corrected. Not just me and Tenya. He tried to go for Hitoshi. I know. Ijiro's voice broke, and he pressed some bandages on another wound. Izuku thought about letting it go for the moment, until he wasn't bleeding, but he didn't want to leave Ijiro's current thoughts as the end of the conversation. Had to at least have a distraction. Shoto, he said. I'm here. Are you sure you are going to be okay? Yes, but can you do one thing for me? Yes. Slappy eye for me. Silence. Just a soft slap. It won't hurt him. He just had a sword break on his neck. The slap was barely audible, but it was there. After a short pause, Ijiro kept dressing Izuku's wounds. Are those men? Shoto asked. Not dead, Izuku said as briefly as possible. He didn't want to talk about native to not expose anything by accident. I'll go check on them. He left, leaving Izuku alone with Ijiro for a moment. He was already finishing on the last wound. You are pretty good at that, Izuku said. At least a lot better than in the first aid class. I practiced at home. There is no point in saving people from villains if I can't keep them alive long enough for that to matter.
Sounds familiar.
I still can't do more than this, Ijiro said after stemming the last of the bleeding. It's plenty. Even in silence he could sense Ijiro's restlessness now that he wasn't keeping himself occupied, but that didn't necessarily translate into paying attention. Izuku decided to risk it as he opened his eyes. How's Stain? We can't risk him escaping. Shoto's ice is holding him. He's unconscious. I hope. Yep, too pure and in need of therapy, just like Izuku. For the therapy part, certainly not for pureness. He still probably has weapons and knives. You should search him. Ask Shoto to help with the ice and keeping him restrained. Are you sure? Fingers pressed against Izuku's shoulder. Yeah, I'm not dying right now, Doc Hiroshima. You should focus on making sure there are no more patients. That's what you do best. Right? He did not sound convinced. Okay. I'll be close. Shout if you need something. I already have everything I need here, Izuku whispered. Well, a pillow would be nice. Ijiro hesitated for a moment, but went to do as Izuku asked, calling for Shoto to join him. They took a moment working together to deal with Stain, taking away all sorts of sharp things and tying his hands. You should take away all of the bandages on his arms, Izuku said just loud enough. He probably has something hidden under them. Okay. And tie his hands behind his back, so it is harder to do anything if he is still hiding something. After another moment of waiting, Izuku pushed himself up a bit to see down the alley. Hitoshi was talking, kneeling next to Tenya, who was sitting against the wall. At least Stain's quirks effects seemed to have ended. Unfortunately, that also applied to native. Brave, on the other hand, was still not moving, even though Hitoshi had pulled him next to Tenya. Izuku laid back down, confident enough he was in good hands. Now they just needed to wait till Stain was secured and Brave got up. A bit later, steps approached Izuku. He regretted looking in the direction as native was walking to him. Stain had used his quirk on the scum quickly, so unfortunately he wasn't very hurt. Quite the impressive fight you put up, young man. Thank you. Even if he beat you too. This murderer would have killed me if you hadn't arrived when you did. You even managed to fight him without taking his quirk stealer. He grinned and said it in a joking way that made it hard to say if he was just stupid enough to think that was funny or genuinely berating him, but not willing to show it openly in this situation. Something felt slimy either way, and not in the good way, like when Izuku's resident puppet master tugged at his strings for his benefit. It's Kururu for you, Izuku responded, starting an awkward silence as he did. Anyway, native said eventually, seems you are going to need some help getting out of here. Mind if I carry you? It is the least I can do after being so useless. Pros really shouldn't need help from students. Well, wasn't this scam acting humble and helpful? Izuku failed to keep the frown off his face. Native didn't notice or care as he crouched down towards Izuku. Hey, Hitoshi called from behind the man. Leave him to me. It's okay, Native said. I can do at least this much. Something in the words was definitely disingenuous. Back off, Izuku said with perhaps a hint of Shirakuro sneaking into his tone. Briefly, Native's friendly expression cracked with annoyance shining through, but a hand appeared over his shoulder and softly pushed it, convincing him to move so Hitoshi could take his place. Hitoshi stared at Izuku for a few seconds as his eyes moved from one injury to another, but then his lips turned up teasingly and he crouched next to Izuku. Seems I finally get to take you to a doctor instead of the other way around. I've been waiting for this day for so long, and all it took was a single serial killer. I expected better from you. He tisked and shook his head. That got a chuckle out of Izuku. I will be okay. Thank you for asking. Seems Ijiro makes for a pretty decent medic, but that guy was right on one thing. Hitoshi pointed a thumb at Native. You aren't walking out of this alley. No, don't even try it. Worried I'd hurt myself more? Worried I don't get to pay you back for treating me like a bag of rice. Izuku squeezed his lips together, thinking about a response. Watch your words, or I'm going to carry you out bridal style, Izu. On your back is fine, Izuku said. I knew you'd know what is best. It is easier for you that way. Izuku delivered his finishing blow. Okay, let's go. Hitoshi moved closer and carefully lifted Izuku's less hurt arm over his shoulder to pick him up. As he started actually pulling Izuku up, he grunted, and the first yank did not go as far as he probably expected. Too heavy? Izuku asked and smirked. Should we add more strength training? No, not too heavy, just heavier than you look. Hitoshi pulled again and got Izuku over his shoulders. You know you were supposed to lift the dumbbells, not eat them. I think you weigh more than Ijiro, and he is a bit taller than you. Hey, you need to eat a lot of iron to build muscle. Well, your diet does not seem to be an issue for you. Hitoshi bumped Izuku a little to adjust his hold. Some blood dripped down his back. Izuku turned his head to look elsewhere. Stain had come back to consciousness, but one of his hands was hanging uselessly from what used to be a shoulder. It didn't really have the shape of one anymore, more of an uneven slope from neck to low-hanging arm. The hands themselves were tightly tied together and in the even tighter grasp of 5 rocky fingers. Izuku was pretty confident he would not escape that even though Ijiro wasn't really watching him. Izuku whispered to Hitoshi, I think you might have a new patient. I noticed, but you are going to help with this one. Anything you need? Whatever he needs. You can probably understand what he is feeling the best. When Stain came for me, Hitoshi paused. Frankly, their therapist probably needed therapy too. Ijiro saved me. After everyone Stain has killed, there was no way I wouldn't have gotten stabbed to death. Maybe if he got you alone long enough. But, no buts. Hitoshi's head brushes against Izuku as he shook it. If Ijiro was slower. His voice failed for a moment. Well, he wasn't. Izuku tried to comfort him. And the only reason Stain came for you was because he realized who was the biggest threat. Izuku, focus, Hitoshi said in gentler tone than was usually used for those words. I was sort of focused on the knife at first, but after Ijiro hit Stain, I saw his face. I have seen that stare before, not on Ijiro, on you. Like last time I almost got stabbed, when Bakugo almost blew me to pieces, when villains attacked us at USJ, and actually tried to stab me there too, when my old bullies showed up at the sports festival, even when that paparazzi harassed Todoroki. Ijiro looked just like you at those times. So it is as serious as I thought, Izuku muttered. I have no issue with how he looked, but I don't think he was prepared for what happened after. When you are prepared to do anything for someone without thinking, it can be hard afterwards when you do, whether you were right or not. Izuku shared his insight. Also, EI's idea of fighting and getting injured may still be a little inaccurate, Hitoshi suggested. Naive, Izuku corrected and looked at the redhead that was now almost next to them. For most people, life and death battles are not something you get through with nothing but bruises on either side. They both glanced at Stain's used-to-be shoulder at the same time. Ijiro looked down quickly. I wasn't aiming there. If he hadn't moved just in time, he'd be like the boulder on my yard, Izuku finished. Ijiro nodded. If he hadn't dodged my shots, he'd be a lot less than even that, Izuku emphasized. Remember, he tried to kill Tenya and Hitoshi, And you? Fakes. They are both fakes. The world will be purged. Shut up, killer, Native barked from behind them. You will have time to talk your tongue off during the interrogation. Hope they give you the behind closed doors treatment. Stain glanced around at them, somehow not held back by the massive injuries right next to his neck. His gaze lingered on Izuku just a little longer than others. You want me to talk, Stain said, still mustering a deranged smile. Perhaps I will. I hear prison can be quite boring. Who knows what I might say if I have to sit there long enough. People need to know the truths of this world one way or another. A shiver went through Izuku at the implications of those words hit him. You can keep your deranged ideologies to yourself. Just keep walking, Native said, acting like he was in charge or responsible for the killer's defeat. If Stain talked, Native would have no hesitation in catching a Shigaraki, or trying to catch one at least. That much was clear to both Izuku and Stain. They made a stop where Tenya and Brave were waiting. Tenya only had injuries to his upper body, so he could walk out of the alley himself, walking head down next to Hitoshi and Izuku on Hitoshi's shoulders. Native walked past Brave, still paralyzed. Ijiro stopped to toss the hero over his shoulder and then jogged to catch up to the rest of the group, carrying the hero. Mr. Brave didn't seem very impressive of a hero while hanging over his student's shoulder, but Izuku wasn't really in the position to comment on that. Should we do something about the other battle? Shoto asked. He had been walking on the other side of Hitoshi out of Izuku's sight. No, Native said. As the only pro here, or the only one still on my feet anyway, because he had been the first to be paralyzed. I can't let students endanger themselves under my watch, running into danger if the battle is still going on. Plus half of us are injured, you included, Izuku said. Yes, but that is on the heroes you were with. They are the ones carrying the consequences of your injuries. Don't worry, I'll make sure people know how bravely you tried to help me. Tried. They did a bit more than tried, especially Ijiro. They finally exited the alley to an empty street. Everyone who had been out at this hour had either escaped or found shelter after the Nomu attack started. Hey, an unfamiliar female voice shouted. Izuku only saw her when Hitoshi turned towards the voice. It was a female hero with some kind of gas mask and perhaps green hair. In dark, it was hard to say exactly as she approached. She was with muscular man not much taller in light blue martial arts gi. Izuku recognized them both. He had investigated everyone that anyone present had as much as considered interning with. Why did you? She asked. Who is that? Hitoshi started. It's Stain, Native said. He tried to kill me, and these kids decided they wanted to help. He glanced at Brave and literally patted Ijiro's head. This one was especially impressive, but he is lucky his quirk was good for keeping him alive against swords. Unfortunately, handling himself, and his student was bit too much for Brave, and he got hit by Stain's quirk. He'll be okay in a moment. You mean he got paralyzed just like you, and were both saved by students? Izuku said and nodded at Ijiro, especially this one. Not that you would have lived long enough for him to show up if Tenya wasn't being stupid. Yes, you were helpful, but try not to let it go to your head, Native said. Also, it is not polite to try to embarrass people. You shouldn't forget Brave is still pro even if he got hit by a quirk. I mean, it would be pretty embarrassing if his intern was already stronger than him. Since Ijiro was still standing next to Hitoshi, Izuku could see Brave's face tense and twist in. Concern maybe? Next, his leg moved, getting Ijiro's attention, so he put the man down on his feet. He faced Ijiro. Good job, you, he hesitated. We're of great help. Even Ijiro raised his eyebrows at that comment. As were the rest of you, Brave quickly added. But he was already on Izuku's bad list, maybe not as high as Native, but on the list nevertheless. Should have let Stain take them, he muttered accidentally, low enough only Hitoshi could hear him. Izuku really needed to work on his self-control even around his therapist. Well, I'm glad to hear that much at least, Ms. Joke said. But I have to talk to Aizawa about you running off on your own. Izuku could hear Hitoshi gulp. That was nothing compared to the jump when Stain started suddenly cackling maniacally. You are truly the fakes I knew you to be, even worse. Not only you use your position for personal gain, but you exploit others and have even fallen low enough to steal achievements of children already stronger and closer to being heroes than you. The killer, previously barely standing up, stood up straight, his long tongue hanging under the fanatic stare. The word hero has lost all meaning in this society. He tilted his head to face Native. The world is overrun by fakes and criminals like you who chase petty greeds. He twisted around in emotion so quick it was hard to follow, but Native had lost his grip on him by the time he had turned around. Stain's arms, previously tied behind his back, were suddenly on the front as Stain ignored pain and injury, taking full advantage of his destroyed shoulder, not posing normal restrictions of movements anymore. You must all be purged. Stain's working hand brushed by his head and the fabric surrounding his eyes. Something glinted in light of nearby street lamp in the hand striking at Native. Ijiro and Brave were already turning to stop him while Native tried to evade. The small sharp object brushed against Native's neck. Ijiro's fingers closed around Stain's arm. There was a clinging sound. Stain's arm got yanked away before cutting deep, and the razor blade fell on the ground once Ijiro's other hand grabbed his wrist. By the time the man's lower body was trapped in ice. "You will be purged," Stain said defiantly, even as his tone was weaker. "Huh." Ijiro sighed and glanced at Native. "Hey, are you okay?" "Yeah, I think we'll be," Native said, holding his bleeding neck, but unfortunately not bleeding enough. "So," Thunder spoke, "what did you say about how helpful these children were?" Native responded with glare and a huff. "Well, I am sure we get to go through the exact events with better time." "We sure will," Ms. Joke said. "Now we should focus on getting all of those injuries treated. I already asked for an ambulance. Shinso, you should find somewhere to let a load off your shoulder in the meanwhile." "It's okay. I can wait," Hitoshi said and bumped Izuku a bit to prevent him from sliding. "He didn't put me down before getting to ambulance, so why would I?" "You are just enjoying having things this way this time," Izuku said. "Oh, this is him," Ms. Joke said. Most notable thing in her words was the lack of hostility or fear Izuku was used to. He'd have to interrogate Hitoshi on what he had been telling to the woman. "Shinso has talked a bit about you." "Don't believe a word he said." "Oh yes, I think I will. Even more now. This has been quite enlightening compared to news and online discussions." "That is a pretty low bar." "Perhaps, but..." "Shinso, are you sure you don't want to lay him down?" "Only in an ambulance or hospital." Joke's mouth was hidden, but her eyes smiled even in the darkness. "As I thought. I am going to take your coffee away," Izuku threatened. Hitoshi hesitated for a second. "Still worth it." Izuku decided to let Hitoshi have his fun, if he really considered carrying someone on his back as fun. Izuku didn't actually mind being in that position, even if he huffed about it for Hitoshi's entertainment. It wasn't a bad place to be, minus the painful injuries. Perhaps they could do this as training. They could have a friend carrying contest, perhaps an obstacle course. There was a distant sound of an ambulance siren, possibly signaling Izuku's ride was approaching its end, but it was soon covered by a different screech behind Hitoshi and Izuku. One of Father's Nomus, one with wings, was flying fast over the street towards them. Its tone was unusual, not the normal aggressively animalistic as tended to be the case when the Nomu bothered expressing themselves in the first place. It felt something more urgent and pained. Izuku might have made a couple of Nomus make such noise during training. As Izuku stared, the Nomu stopped midair, and its eyes met his own. It dove towards the group, more specifically towards Izuku, looking to the others like it was attacking. And for them it probably was. What if it thought they, especially Hitoshi, had injured and captured Izuku? There was no time to hesitate. Father could complain to Tamura. With an open wound in his hand, lighting the dragon blade hurt extra bad as the bandages got torched, but at least that arm could still move. He swung it out towards the Nomu and shot before Ijiro jumped in the way. The shining blue blast was weaker than he had used earlier, but it hit the Nomu in the middle of its chest, causing it to jolt back. The next second it caught in fire, and not just a little shimmering where Izuku had hit, but full-on lit the entire street with flames that soon turned blue. The burning mess fell on the ground. "That's new," Hitoshi said, but Izuku frowned. "That wasn't me," he glanced at Shoto. "And it wasn't Shoto." Izuku could feel Hitoshi's hold tighten as Izuku's words, and probably their tone made him tense. "So," Hitoshi started before the form of a very large man formed behind the burning Nomu with flames shining on his shoulders. Shoto hissed, a high-pitched hiss of fear, and he took several steps backwards until he was further back than Hitoshi and Ijiro. "I don't think this is good," Ijiro said. "No," Izuku responded, speaking only in whisper. "Keep close to Shoto. He should know that no one gets hurt behind Red Riot. What about you two?" "It's okay," Izuku assured as his backhand moved out of Endeavor's sight to Hitoshi's arm right under the short sleeve. "You should have put on something warmer for night patrol," he muttered. "Yes, Dad. At least I got a shirt," Hitoshi muttered as Ijiro moved in front of Shoto. "Now shut up and take it if you need to." Izuku started quietly pulling in the brainwashing quirk as soon as Hitoshi gave the permission. Endeavor stepped over the burning Nomu, through the flames like he was trying to make himself look as intimidating as possible. It was working. Izuku didn't need calm mind to focus on the villain in a hero's costume, even as Endeavor completely ignored him, looking past Izuku and Hitoshi right at Shoto. "Shoto, what are you doing here?" Shoto moved a bit more behind Ijiro. "He is here because he is interning with me," Thunder said, sounding like he might be ready to stand against the number 2. And by that Izuku did not think about the rankings, which I as his father have not approved. "Shoto, get here." Shoto did not move. Ijiro hardened. Native looked surprised. "What do you think you are doing?" He tried to push Ijiro's shoulder, but could not move the boulder that had decided to not move. Thunder, on the other hand, moved closer. "I believe you are not supposed to approach him currently," he said. "He is my son, and he should be interning with my agency." Endeavor sneered as he walked closer. "Step aside, low ranker. I cannot do that. For this week at least, he has been trusted under my care as my student, and master should not allow their student to come to harm." "You." Temperature around Endeavor increased. "Hey!" Izuku shouted. Endeavor did not respond but turned his head just enough for a single eye to stare at Izuku like something between a bug and a piece of something smelly. He kept walking. New flames formed around his hand. "Stay away from them," Izuku said with more urgency, but also with threat in his voice, however effective that could be while he was being carried over Hitoshi's shoulders. He had gotten through Stain without losing anyone. Would everything really fall now because of Endeavor? Izuku was barely holding regeneration back from healing him enough to jump at the man. Endeavor raised his flaming hand, as if he was going to backhand slap Ijiro out of the way. The flames got brighter, bright enough to make Izuku worry, even for Ijiro, who still didn't back down. "Talk about proving to everyone what flaming garbage you really are," Hitoshi said with impossible calmness. "Not having either wife or a child to beat since sports festival must have been difficult for you. How have you coped? Any criminals gone missing in your area?" Hitoshi paused. "Or perhaps young women. Seems to be the theme of the day." Now Endeavor spun around right in front of Ijiro, and Thunder mouth open ready to respond. As soon as he saw Hitoshi, it snapped shut. He took a couple steps to loom over Hitoshi, and Izuku waiting just long enough. "I have half a mind to." Dragon Blade came to life on the hand Izuku could still move. "To what?" "At this rate, you'll..." Endeavor's eyes glazed over, and his flames disappeared. Hitoshi's shoulders slumped down under Izuku as he relaxed. "What did you do?" Native asked and reached for Endeavor. It was blocked by a large red bird feather that somehow did not move aside as soon as it brushed against him. "Hey, it's Midoriya," Dark Shadow shouted from above. "He looks bad. Who did this? Was it that guy he called burning garbage? I'll crush him." "Dark Shadow." Tokoyami snapped as 2 pairs of feet touched the ground. The pro-hero Hawks walked into Izuku's vision, a finger on his chin, in an excessively casual expression. "I should ask why you would be doing this to one of the top heroes of this country, but I get the feeling that conversation is better had with a smaller group. Besides," he held up his phone standing in front of Endeavor and took a bunch of selfies. "I should thank you for this opportunity." An ambulance turned corner down the street as Tokoyami came to Hitoshi and Izuku. "Seems you have traversed a great darkness, Midoriya. Will you be okay?"
Yeah.
Izuku began assuring, but was interrupted. "Of course he will," Dark Shadow said. "He was tough enough to have me. By the way, who's the iced guy?" "That would be Stain," Izuku responded. Help us make sure he gets taken in safely. Nope, Hitoshi said, turned and headed to the ambulance that had just stopped. As far as you are concerned, there is no us in that. He put Izuku down on a stretcher that had barely been brought out and looked at the medic in the eyes. Don't let him get away before he has been properly treated. Don't worry, he's in good hands, and doesn't look like he is going anywhere soon. And Titanic couldn't sink. Just make sure he doesn't try to get up too soon. I see, one of those cases, the medic responded. You wouldn't believe. Tenya, you two get on. See what I have to deal with, Izuku said, reaching for Hitoshi. That's my line, Hitoshi said and slapped Izuku's hand away. If you give my quirk back now, it will stop working. Right, Izuku said. Thankfully, a second ambulance arrived with police before Native tried to jam in the same one. Sharing with Tenya was something Izuku very much did not mind. He wouldn't have had it any other way, even if he didn't feel like talking much with the paramedic present. Tenya just sat head down next to Izuku's stretcher. Also the painkillers. It had been a long time since Izuku had been in pain for this long continuously, but whatever was injected into his arm was absolutely the good stuff. It made him a little dizzy. Since they were safe now, he rested his eyes, just for a moment,